come in, Lyle, or go out.
Okay, it's rolling. Okay, could you state your name, please?
My name is Myrtle L. Derscheid. My husband nicknamed me Bonnie when I started going with him. So I'm Bonnie Derscheid to all my friends.
Okay,
Not all my relatives, but to all my friends.
This interview is being done on April the 26th, 1997 at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. Interviewed by Dr. Vernon L. Williams, Department of History at ACU. If you would, let's start off by looking at your childhood, your parents. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, who your parents were, what kind of family environment you grew up in.
Well, my mother and dad came from Nebraska in 1917. I'm wrong there. I was trying to think how old my sister was. She was about a year old, and she was born in 15, so they came in 16. And settled in Sully County area in South Dakota, and farmed for many years. And I was born on a farm about about 5 in the morning on January 21st, 1919. And I have an older sister and a younger brother, and we were raised in around Agar, South Dakota, Oneida, South Dakota, and I moved to Pierre when I was in 6th grade, and I finished high school in Pierre. And my father, after we moved to town, my father had several jobs. We were very, very poor, like all the rest of the people that went through the Depression, and watched the grasshoppers eat everything that we had. And he took jobs that were very low paying, because that's all he could get. But we always stuck together and managed to get by. And then after I graduated from high school, I did housework for people because there were no jobs that I could. I had taken shorthand and typing in high school, and there were no jobs for secretaries. And then I had a job. I did the housework, and then I worked in an insurance company later on, and typed form letters once a month for them. And I also later on worked for the superintendent of schools on NYA. I worked for the superintendent of the school out at the Indian school, and so I had various types of jobs. And then I met Lyle.
Describe that event.
Well, it's real funny. Lyle and I cannot remember meeting the first time. We met at a dance that they had out at the CCC camp. And the second time, I had gone to Fort Pierre, and he was over there, and I had gone to this nightclub. And he was dating another girl, and I was dating another boy. But I went home with him that night. Well, Lyle continued to date the girl, but the boy that I went with would not date me anymore. So I kind of took him away from the other girl, and we started dating some. And this went on for, like he said, over 3 years. And then I went to Brookings, and we were married. I went to Brookings on July 4th, and we were married September 8th, 1940. And when I first went to Brookings, I worked for a family who had 2 children, and I worked for 2 weeks because I found out that she expected me to be there for 7 days a week, all the days, through the evenings, because they were quite the country club group, or belonged to country club. And so I decided that wasn't for me, and I started working for another family who had 4 children who were older, who didn't have to be babysat. And I worked for them when I got married. And then we were married in September. And I think it was the next November that I got a job in a law office, and I made 30 cents an hour. And I worked half days in Saturday morning. And then there was an insurance man in town who used to come up, and I would type letters for him. And so all in all, we were managing to pay the rent and buy the food. And the first summer we were married, we saved $70, which was his tuition for the year. And as time went on, we seemed to be making a little more progress. And later on, I started working for the Dean of Engineering. By then the war had started, and they had, what was it called? National, it was called what, Lyle? National Defense, yeah. And I was in charge of the 3 programs, did all the secretarial work, because my boss, the dean, was in charge of the overall thing. And I worked there.
Hold on a second. You'll clip that back on. Her mic is falling off. Hold on just a second. Oh, okay. You were talking about your job at National Defense job with the Dean of Engineering.
Yes. And I was making $60 a month, which is really quite a bit of money after working for 30 cents an hour. It was only about $6.90 a week at the law office. But then I started getting, another year later, I started getting $65 a month. And Lyle had taken a job beside the one he had in the seed lab. He worked for the military that came to the state university after the war started. And he taught some military classes to they were the aviation CPT, older men who were taking some aviation training, but they also had to have some military training too. And so things were really looking up for us, because he was making $1.25 an hour, and I was making $65 a month. And then I became pregnant, and of course at that time you did not work when you were pregnant. You usually went home and closed the door so no one could see you. I did work for 4 months, and I had to go in and tell my boss that I was quitting, and he really wanted me to stay. He apparently was one of these that didn't worry about it, but I decided to quit, and Lyle went into the service, and I stayed in Brookings for a short time, and then I went to Huron to stay with his folks. And I was there until I went down to West Point. And I had a terrible experience the first time I went to West Point. I got on the train at 6 o'clock one morning, and I was supposed to I did get into Louisville at 7 o'clock the next morning. Well, Lyle was supposed to pick me up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning because he could get out of camp. And he wasn't there. And I didn't know what to do. So I took a bus to West Point, which was the town that was closest to Fort Knox. And I sat there waiting all day because I guess he couldn't. I sat there waiting all day because he thought I was going to come in later in the day. And I saw him drive by on his way to Louisville to pick me up. And so I sat there for, I suspect, another couple hours and waited for him. Actually, I was in tears when I saw him go by. And that night, we didn't have a place to stay. His brother was with us. We finally found a place to stay. And the lady was very suspicious when my husband asked if his brother could stay with us, if there was an extra bed in the room. And then he said, well, I'll let you talk to my wife. Well, here I was, very pregnant. So there was no doubt in our mind that we were very serious about being good people. But we did get a big kick out of her. So then the next day on Sunday he went back to camp, and I headed for West Point to look for a place to live. I did not have a place to live, and there wasn't any place to live. A small hotel there, and there was a young woman whose husband was in camp, and she told me that I could stay with her. It was really nip and tuck because it was a very small place, and so I stayed there with her, and then she finally left, and I had the room alone. And then I found a place that, as Lyle said, was on stilts over the Ohio River, and part of the toilet was over the Ohio River too. So all the sewage flowed down the Ohio River. Then I stayed there until he got his bars, and then I went home, and our daughter was born. And then when she was 6 weeks old, I got on the train again at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we spent the day and that night on the train. Got to Chicago, and I had a child who cried quite frequently at 6 o'clock at night, 7 o'clock at night, and she was screaming her head off, and I had her in a basket. And people were very good to me. One man said, "Oh, young lady, sit up on this stool." He was selling the tickets, and he said, "Sit up on the stool." And he took the basket and the baby, and I took the baby out of the basket and sat there, and another man came along and said, "I will take your things in on the train when you get ready to go." And two ladies took care of her after I got there. When she was crying, they were walking the floor with her. Really, people were very good to me. Well, I arrived down there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I had taken what we called a sleeper, and I was afraid to get undressed for fear she'd cry and wake everyone up that was trying to sleep. So I had slept, and at that time, women wore girdles all the time, and I had slept in my girdle, and I had runners down the front of each stocking when Lyle took me off the bus, or off the train. And we had a little place there, three rooms, kitchen, living, dining room, whatever you call it, and a bedroom. Shared the bath, shared the refrigerator with a southern lady who thought she was really a lady, and a daughter who worked out at the post. And we lived there for several months, but she was very hard to live with. If we had friends in, she locked the door so we couldn't get in the refrigerator, and just nasty little things. So we found a nice little house, and we were thrilled to death that we could take our little girl and let her cry at night for a few hours so she wouldn't be waking us up at 2 and 3 and 4 times a night to eat. We had gotten to the point where every time she opened her mouth, we stuck the bottle in at night because this lady didn't like having her cry. Well, that was no good. And we were there until we left Fort Knox, West Point actually, and came down to Texas, and we had a great trip coming down to Texas. We had 11 flats and 2 blowouts on our trailer. So poor Lyle was constantly having to stop and have tires fixed, and jacking up that trailer was quite a job with just a little car jack. And he was really good about it until we were down in Arkansas, and he said, "I just have to have this one done. I can't take it off." He'd gotten to the point where he'd almost given up. And so we drove into this filling station, and he asked them if they'd fix a tire, and they said, "No, almost time to quit." He said, we just can't do it. And Lyle said, "Well, please let me use your jack." So they did let him use that. And one man so happened that he only had one arm, but he came out and he said, "If you're not through by the time I'm ready to quit, I'll be here to help you." So anyway, we got down to Texas that way, and it was a tough trip. And we set up that night, or that day. We got here about noon, and we were all just really very tired. And Lyle had to get dressed. He had to report to camp by 5 o'clock that day, and so he left. And he said he was walking along, and he had gone one place, and that was the wrong place. So he was walking along someplace, and someone yelled, "Lieutenant, you have your cap on backwards." He had his bar in the back instead of the front. He was too tired to know what direction he was going. And after he left, Karen was crying, and I just laid her in a crib, and she went to sleep, and I went to sleep. And then he came home that night. And on that trip, we became kind of broke because of we didn't have a lot of money, but we had a lot of problems. And we had tried to get to a town. We had some bonds, and we had tried to get to towns. And at that time, they only cashed the bonds at certain banks, and we wouldn't get there on time. We didn't have a lot, but it would help. And finally, Lyle went to the Red Cross. No one would take checks. So Lyle went to the Red Cross, and we borrowed $25 from them. And then we tried to write a check just the last, I don't know what the name of the town was, just before we got to Abilene. And the man said, "Oh yes, I'll take a check for gas." And then after Lyle had written it, he said, "Oh, I've been drinking, I just don't think I better." And that was the first time I'd heard Lyle really blow a stack at people. That he was really angry. Well, we arrived here, and anyway, we went to Sewell's Park, and Lyle went to camp, and he came home. And as I said, we didn't have much money, and we came home. He came back to the trailer that night, and he said, "Look, I have $70. And I said, "Where in the world did you get $70? He said, "Well, I got into a little poker game, and I really didn't approve of poker." Well, it really was his travel pay that he had been given right away when he got there, so that saved us. And we lived in that little place until Lyle went overseas, and that was a sad time in my life.
Well, tell us, before you get to that, tell us a little more about
what I did.
What did you do during the day, and how did you have to deal with shopping? In other words, what was available, what was not available?
Oh, okay. Actually, I have tried to remember what little store we shopped at. It was a little neighborhood grocery, very close to this park that we lived in. And if we can possibly find this park or this trailer park, we're going to look for it. But I don't know. I had no problems getting the things we needed so much when I lived here, I guess, is after Lyle went overseas. Maybe we could get soap, and we did get coffee, but we had to have stamps. And Lyle and I, at that time, didn't drink coffee, so it didn't make too much difference. It was when I went to live with my folks that I noticed more things had to be, you had to wait for more things.
Mm-hmm.
But so many times when you had a youngster, people would let you have a bar of Ivory soap because you needed it for the youngster. And of course, gas we didn't use that much when Lyle was here. When I went to San Diego to live with my parents, then I had to get gas ration stamps. But we had some, but we always seemed to get by. And I don't know if they gave Lyle stamps when he left to come home for his leave. And I know one time we came home on the train rather than drive. But I didn't really feel that I had was missing too many things. We could get most everything. We had coupons for sugar, and I remember that when I lived with my parents, that my mother had a lady that worked in a store who knew her real well, and she used to hide the soap under the counter, and when we came in, we'd get 2 or 3 bars at a time. But here in Abilene, I have tried to think what kind of a store I shopped in. The only one I can think of is that little corner grocery, I'll call it. And I don't recognize any of the buildings downtown, where we were this morning. Not even the train depot.
What about other people that lived in trailers in the park with you? You remember any of those families?
Yes. It was a very small park, and I just remember the one couple there was a warrant officer and his wife who lived there, and they had a little girl that was a little bit older than Karen. And she and I spent a lot of time together in the daytime. And she didn't drive, and I did, so I used to take her some places, and she was still there when I left, so I don't know whatever happened to her. And then when Lyle went overseas, I'm kind of getting things mixed up here, but when he went overseas, I was left with a trailer, and we had to sell it because I didn't want to haul it, or I didn't want to stay here, and I didn't want to haul it around. And so it had needed the roof painted before I left, but he hadn't had time. So after he left, I put on his old fatigues and I climbed up and painted the roof on the trailer before I sold it. And then I sold it, and I moved into a little trailer that they had there for rent. And the man who bought the trailer was not a nice man to deal with. He kept trying and trying and trying to get me to sell it for less because he knew I wanted to leave. But I wouldn't do it. And he finally bought it, and when he bought it, he demanded I move out that very day. So I quick moved my things out into this smaller trailer. And when he came back into the park to stay a couple of nights, he had ripped the side out of it, and I said he deserved that after the way he treated me.
What about recreation?
Not much. We didn't really do much of anything. As I recall, I guess maybe we were just glad to be together because he was gone a lot of times 7 days a week when he had to go out in the field, and sometimes we went out and picked him up on Saturday noon, and no, we didn't. And of course, again, I don't think we had a lot of money. I mean, the second lieutenant's pay was not that great.
Do you remember anything about the people who owned the
Yes.
Sewell's Park?
Yes, the Sewells were very good people. They were very kind to me, and they were very kind to everyone who lived there. And May was the wife, and she was a mother to all of us. And one night she said to the warrant officer's wife, I cannot remember her name. I can remember the daughter's name, but I can't remember the lady's name. She said, I really think you girls ought to go down and go to a movie. That was after the men had left. And so she took care of the girls, and we went down to a movie, but that's the only time we went. But as far as recreation was concerned, we didn't do a great deal.
Any other impressions of Abilene in terms of living here, what it was like, people that you encountered?
Well, actually, I didn't. As I said, I didn't go very much. And I don't recall being downtown, which is too bad, but I just don't. And I did some sewing, so I didn't buy many clothes. And I just don't recall. Of course, I wasn't here, an awfully long time.
What about, you say you have the car a lot. How did Lyle get out to Barkley?
Well, he used to I would take him out if he was going to be gone for, I used to take him out there, and I've always driven the car. I drove when we were living down in Fort Knox, and I've always driven the car. Still do.
Well, take us back to the day that you and your daughter went out to camp and Lyle was packing the night before departure. Tell me a little bit about that.
That was one of the saddest days of my life. I went out early in the evening, like 6 o'clock, and Lyle was busy because he was in charge of this one car and getting it loaded. And so he would drive from place to place, and we would sit while he was doing what he had to do. And then he parked it in front of this one, and he was busy. We could see him. We could watch him. And then this, I suppose it was a platoon, was a large group of soldiers, went marching by, and that would That would really break your heart to see them go by and know what what was going to happen to them.
What about other wives? Were any of the other wives there?
No, I wasn't. I really didn't have any friends of. I guess I was with the wives twice, and that was about it. They really didn't have. They didn't do much socializing, and I don't even know where the others lived. But at Fort Knox, we didn't do much socializing too. They just didn't do what they do during peacetime, I guess. At least the group that we were around didn't.
So were you there the next morning when they pulled out, or was
No.
it that night was the last time you saw
That
him?
was the last time I saw him.
Tell us a little bit about that final goodbye, if you can.
I don't know. I might cry. Well, I didn't cry. Lyle cried when he kissed his daughter goodbye, and I didn't until about, I guess it must have been 2 or 3 days later. It wasn't his troop train, but it went by. And then I really did cry. And I went home that night, and I didn't sleep. And I didn't talk to anyone, really. I would go over to the restaurant and eat my meal because I didn't want to cook for myself. And Karen was young enough that she didn't eat, too much adult food. And it was a tough time. And it was tough being away from family. I had no family here. And that's when I decided that I would go to my folks. Well, I'm sure Lyle didn't want me to be all alone out here in Abilene. We hadn't planned for me to be. But it was a very rotten time.
Well, what about the time when you left? You got the trailer sold. What happened next? Take us on that trip.
Oh, well, I sold the trailer, and I kept trying to find someone to ride with me. I found a young soldier who wanted to drive straight through, and our car was in good shape. And I was afraid that if he tried to drive straight, we tried to drive straight through, that he would probably ruin our car. And then we had I had an older woman, and I laugh now when I say older woman, who was a grandmother who wanted to go along, and I was afraid she might fuss at my child. So I said, no way, I'll just do it alone. So one day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was at noon, I guess, I drove up and filled up the car with gas, and May Sewell had tears rolling down her cheeks. She said, oh, you can't go. You just can't go by yourself. And I said, but I'm going, and so I did. And she was terribly upset with me. And the first day I was frightened. And the second day I was frightened. I was frightened on the whole trip, but I just gritted my teeth and left. And I remember I got to Yuma on the last night. And I've always been afraid to stay alone. I still don't like staying alone. And I got to this trailer park, or this, they call them motels now. They used to call them, not motels.
Motor courts?
Yeah, courts. And I went up to the desk and got my room, and the lady said, don't go downtown to eat. She said, we have the colored people and the white people down there, and she said they get into fights all the time because they had an air base there. And that, of course, didn't make me feel too good. So I stayed. We went and ate, and I came back. And about 4:30 in the morning, I woke Karen up. I hadn't been asleep. And I woke her up, and of course, she'd been asleep for many hours, so she was really bouncing ready to go. So we left about 5 and finished our trip to San Diego. But on the way, I was in El Centro, and I was visiting with a man who was selling me the gas, and I was showing him these coupons I had that were coupons I had left over from the gas stove we had in our trailer, and he said, "Oh, I'll trade you gas for those." So I had some extra gas stamps. And I should back up and say that it. I went to the post, and they gave me enough gas to drive to make the trip, and they even checked the miles very close. I don't suppose they gave me 10 miles extra than what I was going to drive. And I had enough gas to get there, and I arrived in San Diego about noon. And the first thing my mother said to me, "You came alone, didn't you?" She said, "I knew you'd do that." And I said, "Yes." But I was young and brave at that time. And we lived with my mother and dad all the time that Lyle was gone. And they were happy to have us, because I had a brother in the Army, and they were alone and very lonely, and so they were happy to have us. And then Lyle came to Santa Barbara, and the first call he made, I can't describe my feelings when he arrived back in the States, because we had already lost his brother, and you know, you just don't know, even if they're on their way home, whether they're going to get home. And then I found out that he was going to Santa Barbara, and so Karen and I packed up and went over there and rented a place in a court. And the first one we lived in was just one big room, and then the second one we moved to a different court, and I had a bedroom that had a kitchen at one end and a bathroom, and then there was a one that had 3 rooms, and I finally rented that, and the man who owned the place said, "Don't think you're going to get any better one, because the next one is my house, and you're not going to move in there." So I couldn't. We were there while Lyle was in the Army hospital, and enjoyed Santa Barbara.
How did you find out about him being wounded?
Oh, I should tell that. I was home. My parents had gone to a movie, and someone rang the bell on the apartment door, and I opened the door, and I knew right away that something had happened. And he said, "It's not bad, it's not bad." And they said that he was slightly wounded. So I thought, well, he'll be back in the lines in a very short time. And then I got a letter from him, and he talked about seeing me, and then I got a letter that had been written before this one. He wrote on my birthday and said, "This is your birthday present, I'm coming home." But see, I didn't know that. I didn't know that for a long time, because the letters were so far, you know, they came so late. And so then he came back, and we went over there and stayed until he was sent on this leave, and it was really a happy time. I mean, he wasn't well, but it wasn't anything that we couldn't live with, and I felt so thankful that he hadn't been one of those that didn't get back. But,
well, you had quite an experience in World War II. You traveled like a gypsy from Kentucky to Texas to California.
Yeah.
Looking back over that time, are there any other memories that you have that you would like to add to this? Obviously, your daughter was too young to remember that, but I would imagine having her, though, was especially when you were alone, had some impact on you.
It was a lot of responsibility. She was very ill while he was gone, and in those days they didn't do anything for children who became dehydrated because they had flu, stomach flu. And she became very dehydrated, and it was a very upsetting time. And I certainly was thankful that I wasn't all alone with her, that my parents were there to help me out, because my mother and dad were really good. But having a child and being alone is a lot of responsibility.
Well, you went on and had other children.
Yes.
Tell us briefly what's happened to each of those children.
Well, we had Karen during the war, and Karen lives in Michigan, has 2 children, married and has 2 children, and she is in the school system at Lapeer, Michigan. She's had been teaching junior high, and then was teaching the 6th grade. And now, for the past, I think it's 3 years, she has been retraining, I guess is what you would call it, teachers people who teach math, because Michigan has a new program of math in the school systems, and it's a difficult job because it's hard to tell someone you've been teaching math and you haven't been teaching it the way it should be done. She's a very, very capable young woman. Then we have Gary, who is, I should back up and say Karen is going to be 54. Gary was 50 in December, and he's a physical therapist and has 3 clinics in Phoenix. Craig is at a junior college in Illinois, and I'm really proud of my children. They all have master's degrees. They've all worked very hard. They haven't had a lot of financial help from their parents. They've worked for a lot of their education, and they're very hard workers today.
Well, thank you very much. It wasn't that painful, was it?
No, no.